Welcome to the Coffee with Father Barry podcast. In each episode, we'll chat with Father Barry Fisher about his 50 years spent serving the Lord as a missionary priest of the precious blood. Christ's call took him around the globe, from the United States to Latin America, to Rome, Austria, and beyond. Father Barry hopes that through sharing his stories, you too will be inspired to reflect on your own unique faith journey.
Welcome to another episode of Coffee with Father Barry. You have your guide for the day, Kyle McCreary. So, Father Barry, you have spoken in your previous podcasts about the extreme polarization in Chile, as well as your ministry with Christian-based communities. Could you tell us a little bit about how all of this ended?
Yes, well, it certainly ended in a bloody coup. That's how it ended. As I said before in the other podcast, we were going through a lot of food shortages, which kept getting worse and worse. And of course, that affected the people very much. Not the rich people, of course, because they can always find a way to get around it. But the middle class, the poor, they were really suffering. And so the protest was coming stronger and stronger. Sometimes there were marches. And there were also what they called the empty pot protests, where in a certain day of the week or a certain time in the evening, the people would go outside or hang out their windows and beat on empty pots as a protest that they didn't have enough food. So that was really creating a whole movement in Chile. But also the pressure was mounting on the Allende government from within and from without. From within because he had a coalition of leftist parties, and one of those coalition parties was the Communist Party. Now, they were, that particular faction, more of a Marxist bent. They weren't the biggest faction, but they were very vocal. And they kept pressuring Allende to become a dictator. They wanted him to become a dictator. And Allende stubbornly resisted that because he believed in democracy. He had been in Congress for many years. And he wanted to, and he was elected democratically, even though he was looking for socialism. Also from outside, because the United States was really behind a lot of the protests, especially through the telephone company and so forth. But the United States was financing many of those protests. And then toward the end of the government, before the coup, there was a big trucker strike. And that brought everything to a halt in the country. Even basic food stuff that people were getting before could not get through. So that is what you might say broke the camel's back. And that was what led up immediately to the aftermath of the coup. It was later discovered truly that it was financed by the United States government, that trucker strike. There's no way they could have done it without that backing. So in the meantime, the military, one of the members of the government was from the military, or I should say, Allende named the head of the army and so forth. And up until that time, he was quiet. But then he began to organize the golpe de Estado, the coup d'etat, the uprising of the military. And so on September 11th, 1973, in the third year of the Allende government, the military rose up to take over the government. Now, the military at that time, this governing, we call it junta militar, a cohort of the Army general, the Navy admiral, the police, and the Air Force. So they were the four, like generals or heads of all those departments. They formed the junta militar. And so on September 11th, they bombed the presidential palace in the center of the city. And they also, they dropped bombs. The jets just came swooping in and bombing that, as well as the president's personal home. And all of a sudden, then the streets were, all communication was cut off. The streets were filled with military, tanks, soldiers, all kind of military vehicles. And that went on for a number of hours until Allende realized that there was no way that they would have been able to oppose all that force. And then he committed suicide in the palace because he knew if the military ever got him, it wasn't going to be very pleasant for him. So anyway, that was the end of his government. Many prisoners were taken that day. Many were also executed. Those who could, opposers of the government, or I should say people favoring the government, would flee the country if they could, if they weren't taken prisoner or killed. And so then we began 17 years of military dictatorship. 17 years of long dictatorship. At first, they ruled the country, like I say, this junta militar, but eventually it was Pinochet, the army general, who became very clearly the head honcho of this whole thing. A strict curfew then was immediately imposed. The first weeks was a very strict, like 8 o'clock at night until the next morning. So that radically also changed the whole life of the Chilean people because, they were like to go out for supper. No, you could no longer do that because then the waiters had to leave like at 6 o'clock. So that killed nightlife, night-like parties, and so on and so forth. It really radically changed everything because it was so strict that if you were caught outside on the street after curfew, you would be summarily shot. There was no taking and asking, "What are you doing out?" No, they would just kill you. During those years of this Pinochet's government dictatorship, at least 3,000 people are believed to have died, were attributed to the death by the military.
Wow, that almost kind of seems like a movie almost. So, with all these experiences, like how did you personally experience like this time or that a specific day throughout this dictatorship?
Well, and when I first got to Chile, we only went home once every 3 years. We couldn't go home any other time. So that particular year, I was up to go home, and I had gone home. In the third month, we went home once every 3 years for 3 months. So I was in the third month of that time at home in September. And I remember that day very well because I was shopping at a little hardware store in the middle of our town of Colombia. When I came out and got in the car and turned the radio on, they were talking about what was happening in Chile. So I thought, what, Chile? What's going on? And that's when I heard about the military had bombed the palace. Allende was believed to be dead, and all the horrors that were happening there. So it was one of those days like people who are a little bit older than you would remember 9/11, or I remember President Kennedy's assassination, Martin Luther King. So this is one of those days I'll never forget, and it happened to be my birthday, September 11th. So for many years, I refused to celebrate my birthday on the day of 11th of September because I didn't want people to think that I was celebrating the anniversary of the coup, which I was not. And anyway, I was very concerned, and tried to find out how my community members were in Chile, and also how the members of my communities were doing. Because as I said, what happened when the coup occurred, I mentioned how polarized the country was. So family members were also divided. Among themselves, they were divided and vehemently divided, just like in the church community, people were divided. And so some family members would denounce a fellow brother or a parent, and they would be taken prisoner and disappeared. There was that much polarization going on in the country. And fortunately, my parishioners told me when I got back when they finally opened the airports again because they were closed for a couple of weeks. I finally got back in October, and they said, "Father Pepe, we are thankful that you were not here when that coup happened, because you would have been denounced by some of these people in this area and taken prisoner and maybe never seen again." So in that sense, I was fortunate. Also at that time, there was so much fear. The military would go sometimes from house to house, and if they would find, depends what they found in the house, if they found books pertaining to Allende or to his government and so forth, they would have book burnings. And so you would have piles of books and things being burned. Now, my companion, whom I lived with, who was not of the same political points of view as I had, when I was still out of the States, he went into my room and tore down any posters I would have in my room and any books I would have on my shelf pertaining in any way to the government or to socialism or Christians for socialism, and he himself would burn them because he was afraid if they knocked on the door and they found that, then he would be taken away. So that was a real thing. Sometimes you see it in movies, but this really happened in Chile. I experienced that. I mentioned in earlier podcasts that I was living in an apartment with Bernie across the street, literally, from the National Soccer Stadium, which was then a major detention center for political prisoners. And you could hear during the curfew at night, since the only thing you'd hear in the street were tanks rolling down the streets or soldiers marching. But you would hear executions during the night when they would take some of these prisoners and just shoot them, execute them. Others were told to get into a van or to a jeep and that they were going to take them out and be free. So they would go out and then they'd stop down the street outside of the stadium, tell them to get out. You're free. You can get out and go. Well, when they would run, then they'd be shot in the back. And when these people were found, the government would say, well, they tried to escape. That was the excuse. So those were the kind of things we were experiencing on a daily basis. The military junta also declared that Chile was in a state of internal warfare. That's the term that was used in Chile, in Argentina, in Brazil, in Paraguay, Uruguay. At that time, there were a lot of military dictatorships, and there was a common theme, internal warfare. And that's what they used to justify taking anyone that was in opposition to the government. They were considered enemies. And now the church, years later, many people disappeared. We didn't know what happened to them. And many years later, we began to discover common graves, mass graves, which I'll tell you some about that later on.
Wow. I mean, all that I can think about is just a movie. Like, it really doesn't seem that these things can happen, especially in today's world, but unfortunately it still does and definitely did back then. So I know you mentioned a little bit about the parish life there with your community, but what was the position of the Catholic Church like during all of these events?
The Catholic Church never openly supported the coup. They might have been somewhat in favor of it in the sense that the life could not go on as it was. The polarization was so bad in Chile, it just was not possible. But they never supported, obviously, the persecution that came and the suppression of freedoms that came under. At first, it was thought that the government, this military dictatorship, might last for maybe a month or two, and then we go back to normal. Well, it turned out to be 17 years. So the longer that continued, the church then became not openly opposed, and this is the delicate balance the church has to have in those situations. And I think Jorge Bergoglio, the future pope in Argentina, faced this, and he was criticized sometimes because why didn't you do it more forcefully opposing it? And I understand why. And our hierarchy the same way, because if we would have very openly and strongly opposed the government, we would have been persecuted viciously. We already were having problems. Meetings were prohibited. We could not have church gatherings outside of Mass. my Christian-based communities and I, we decided we were going to meet anyway. So we took a chance in meeting in the homes. It was a chance, but we got through it. And a number of our members of our community had also lost loved ones who disappeared or were killed or fled to another country. So the church in those days formed what is called the Vicaría de Solidaridad, also in conjunction with the Lutheran Church, which was the only main Protestant church in Chile at the time. So we collaborated in being in solidarity with the poor and those who were hungry and needy. We were the voice of the voiceless, defender of the persecuted, the option for the poor. Those were all themes which became very much part of the Vicaría de Solidaridad. Now, Pinochet and his regime never understood why the church would be protecting or caring for these enemies of the state. Pinochet would never understand that. And the cardinal told me personally one day in his conversations with the general, if you talk to him about this, about solidarity, persecution of the poor, he was not able to understand it. He just couldn't grasp it. But he was a supreme strategician or a strategist person. You talk about a strategy, a military, he was very, very good. But this thing about defending the poor and caring for them, it just was not in his frame of mind. He couldn't reference it. During that time, the country lived in great fear of this kind of repression, and fear was characteristic of the whole system. I remember going, in those days, mostly in public transportation, and the buses, for example, were extremely quiet. People were afraid to talk because they didn't know if we were sitting next to each other. I didn't know if you were a government informant. And if I would dare to speak and make any kind of criticism, they could just arrest me and take me off. And sometimes the buses, they would get downtown and stop at a red light. Military would get on and take people prisoner from the bus and take them away. So people were afraid to talk. I have some of my own experiences about that. I'll tell you in another podcast. I had some close calls itself. But that was a climate of fear. And the church was working very much in solidarity with those who were widows or alone and help caring for them.
Wow. I mean, you kind of alluded a little bit earlier about how your communities met in solidarity and in secret to still be able to build that community and continue these Catholic Christian traditions. But how I would like to know is a little bit more about that. I mean, how did your Christian-based communities deal with this situation and continue on?
So, as I said before, one of the main problems that affected the people, and especially the families of people who have disappeared, whose husbands were killed, women could not find jobs because if husbands were sympathizers of Allende, no one would hire them. So they said, how are we going to feed my children? My babies and so forth. So this is where we came in as a Christian-based community. I called together a group of these women who were in this dire situation, and sat them down along with some of the people from my community, the Christian-based communities, and as also our youth. And we just go, what can we do? How can we attack this problem and be in solidarity with you? And we decided the most important thing was to figure out how to have a hot meal for these children every day. So, but nobody had all the means to do it themselves. So what did they do? I remember very clearly. One lady would raise her hand and say, well, Father, I could bring a few tea bags. Another person said, well, I could give maybe I have a little bit of half a kilo of rice. Another said, well, I could bring a kilo of spaghetti. Another one, I could bring a little can of pasta. And so they began to say what each one could give a little bit. You might say that was the widow's mite, literally, the story of the widow's mite. and they gave what little they had, but putting it together. So then what do we do, this Christian community? We provided our community members and the youth would go from house to house in the apartments and asking for food donations. So every month we would gather and collect whatever we could from the people, their generosity, what they could give. And then I had access to a car at that time, a community car. And so I would go to all the local supermarkets and butcher shops and ask if they could give me leftover vegetables that they didn't sell that day. And in the butcher shops, do you have any bones that you could give us? Or how about scraps of meat that or fat that you didn't use? And so I would go around all the time to these shops and collect things. So between what I did, what were collected from the homes, and what the women, the poorest, that had nothing, what their contributions, we put together a hot meal for 20 to 30 children, small children, for 2 years. We could do that. And then some of the women, the mothers, and some of my community, the women, they would help to prepare the meal. And I would be there, and some of our youth would help to serve these children. Now, this went on, like I said, for 2 years, until finally the government recognized that there was a problem, and they then began to make an official soup kitchen. But the church led the way and raised the consciousness of all people. So I just want to end by saying that the church in Chile and in Latin America, very concerned with the integral salvation of the people, not just the body, but the soul, the whole person. And that was the emphasis of the Latin American church, what we call integral salvation.
Yeah, going back to that mission that you shared with us, I mean, the reason why you are doing what you were doing is to be with the people. And it's unfortunate that it got to this extent that you were really hand in hand with these people, but I feel like there was so much fruit that was actually born from these experiences, both you personally, but also what you and your community were able to do for these people at that such a horrific time. But as your guide for the day, I want to say thank you so much for spending some time with us. And for our listeners back at home, please tune in to the next episode of Coffee with Father Barry.